Welcome to this video that aims to take you through how to approach the various different types of questions for paper 4 alternative to coursework as part of the Cambridge IGCSE Geography course. So this video really is an introduction to paper 4, and it will break down the various different sections and offer you guidance and hints and tips of the sorts of things that you need to include and consider when answering these questions. Now, I'll be producing other videos throughout the year that will go through the different investigations in more detail. So, for example, the next one I'm hoping to produce is one on the rivers, and so I'll take you through how to approach paper 4 river questions. So I'll be taking you through the various different methods that you'll be expected to know, what sort of points you need to make, and things like that. Now, with paper 4, it's impossible to cover every aspect. Sometimes they will throw in new investigations. There's always different ways of presenting the data, of wording the data. So although I'll give you some more accessible questions in my examples, really it's down to you to practice. So what is paper 4? Really it's the alternative to coursework. Some of you might have started doing coursework, which is where you write a formal investigation, but however your school, for whatever reason, has decided to offer for you to do paper 4. And really it's seen to be an alternative to that. So it's out of 60, and instead of you doing a 60-mark investigation in one location, you will be answering 2 by 30-mark questions. Both questions are compulsory. The exams last 90 minutes. Generally speaking, one of the questions will be on a human investigation, the other will be on a physical investigation, so something on rivers or coasts. And question type can appear in any order. And what I mean by that is that because this is alternative to coursework, and it's out of 60, what they do is, as you can see here, I've put the mark boundaries for the coursework paper component 3. You've got 12 marks for introduction, 12 marks for observation, collection of data, etc. In the alternative to coursework paper, the types of questions they may ask that add up to 12 marks might be to get you to write a hypothesis, define some key terms, answer questions that link to theory and skills studied for paper 1 and 2. For data collection, which is a very common question to ask, they might require you to think about some risks associated with this investigation they're writing about in the paper. Be able to distinguish between primary and secondary data, sampling techniques, and perhaps for 5 or 6 marks, how to collect a piece of data to help you, to enable a student to answer a hypothesis or investigate a hypothesis. As well, you might be asked to complete or draw a range of graphs. You might be aware of a range of data presentation terms and techniques as well. So you might be having to say, why could a chloropleth map be a better presentation technique to answer this question and things like that. And this is where practice comes in, because it's impossible really for me to show you and to take you through how to draw and construct each type of graph, way of presenting data. So this is when you need to practice. 12 marks might be to state if the data shown in the exam proves or disproves a hypothesis and explain or suggest reasons why. And then you might be asked to consider advantages and disadvantages of using a technique to collect data and perhaps suggest improvement. So really the questions they ask very much reflect what you are expected to do and demonstrate in a piece of coursework. However, please bear in mind that it's not as the exam starts off going, the first couple of questions about the introduction, then the next about data collection, etc. These types of questions can appear in anywhere in the paper. So one question might be weighted more heavily on data collection, and then the other question on the other investigation might be more about data presentation techniques. So practice does make perfect. So there is a lot of content to know. However, there are tricks, hence this video, of how you can approach this how you can approach this investigation. So what I'm going to do now is take you through each of those sections that make up the mark scheme for alternative to coursework, and so you can use the chapters then to move on to the various different sections to help you approach them if you are answering, if you're using past papers and you're answering past questions and using this video. So like I said, introduction style questions ask you to construct hypotheses and apply theory and skills. So hypotheses, what are they? On the left, you can see a whole range of different hypotheses there from a range of different past papers. And what you can see at the bottom is I put links to the various past questions to help you with this. So a hypothesis is a prediction of what you think your data will show. So it's something that you make before you go out and collect the data, before you decide what methods you want to make. Generally speaking, you base it on geographical theory, and you assume they are true, but you also have at the back of your mind that for whatever reason, it could come out to be false. As I said, it's based on geographical theory. So for example, a common one for river investigation is the Bradshaw model, which shows how various characteristics of the river should change with distance downstream. And hypothesis should do one of the following. State how something will change along a transect road or river, compare two time periods or two locations, comparing a before and after, and like I said, compare two locations, and state if there's a relationship, negative, positive, between two variables, or simply a statement. So if you can see on the left hand side, you can see I've given you, provided you with a range of different examples of what a hypothesis could look like. So when you're writing hypothesis, that this question asks you to do, you need to remember this. So remember, hypothesis is a prediction of what you think your data will show. So here's a nice simple one. Might investigate through investigation. Do not refer to water pollution. Describe a fieldwork method to test this hypothesis. So this is river investigation. So you're thinking, right, Bradshaw model is perhaps a good one. Now remember, if you cannot remember how to write a hypothesis, read through the exam paper. There will certainly be other examples of what a hypothesis looks like. So again, read through the exam paper to refresh your mind of the type of language that you should use. And in this particular case, it's rivers, so keep it simple, as something, a characteristic of that river, in this case, velocity, should either increase or decrease with distance downstream. And in this case, if it's velocity, the velocity should increase with distance downstream. And here we go. And here what the mark scheme would look like. So you get 1 mark for stating channel width increases downstream, etc., etc. So let's look at some types of questions. Now remember, these tend to be anywhere between 2 and 4 mark style questions. Here's one from a coast investigation. Explain why destructive waves of road beaches and constructive waves deposit material. And here's another one. Which of the following features below is labelled X on figure 1? So there might be a figure 1.1, so there might be an insert. So you have to identify the feature, kind of the paper 2, and then talk about tick which 3 of the following statements about longshore drift are correct. So again, it does require you to have some knowledge of the background information about why a hypothesis is true, or why the hypothesis might be true. So you do have to have that understanding of the theory behind it. Some more questions here. Here it's asking you to talk about the characteristics of constructive and destructive waves, talk about what a groin is, suggest 2 reasons why water pollution levels may vary along a river, and here simple definitions matching a sentence. So a whole range of questions, and like I said, it's anywhere between 1 to 4 marks, typically 2 to 4 marks. Some more for a human investigation. You can see here defining the term squatter settlements, a few map skills here, looking for scale, describe distribution of squatter settlements, very much paper 2 style questions. Give 2 reasons to explain the location of squatter settlements in the city, linking to some background theory. And again, some more settlement style questions as well. So, all of these add up to about, each of them from different papers, add up to about 6 marks and 6 marks again. So if you have a good, solid understanding of the geographical theory behind each investigation, then really these should be quite straightforward marks. And again, that comes with making sure you have done very good revision for paper 1, lots of practice for paper 2 as well, and for paper 4. Using the mark scheme, looking carefully at the mark scheme, and incorporating the points into your revision notes. And just to finalise, here we go, some advantages and disadvantages of constructing a bypass road around the village. So a lot of this is linking back to theory as well. So remember, most of these questions relate to skills or knowledge required for paper 1 and 2. If unsure, use common sense. Think about it. Think about examples that you've experienced or you've read about. Practice. And do incorporate mark schemes and phrases and definitions into your answer, into your notes when you revise. Okay, so moving on to chapter 2. This was a coursework data collection skills. Here, these questions could ask you questions on a whole range of different aspects. So in terms of sampling techniques, date and time, types of data, why we do a pilot study, risk assessments, and describing the various methods. So let's go through them each at one point. So sampling. Here's a hypothesis. Students decided to test the following hypothesis. Can we actually, think about this, ask every tourist who goes to Malta? That's impossible to do. It would take far too much time, money, you would have to have a huge variety of people that are manning the ports and airports, to make sure every person to ask. Again, requiring a lot of people. So obviously we can't do that. So that's why we have to be selected. But when we sample, we have to be certain that what and where we collect will be enough to allow us to make a conclusion. Will be enough, will enable us to collect enough data to prove or disprove our hypothesis. So how can we do this? Sampling. Now, just before we go, you might hear this term a transect. Now, really, a transect particularly applies when we are selecting a road. You might refer to that as a transect, or a straight line. And then you have study sites. So that's kind of like where we've collected our data from. So just have those in the back of your mind, those two terms there. So one very popular form of sampling is what we call systematic sampling. So this is where observations are taken at regular intervals. So, for example, we ask every fifth person. So here we go. And now I'm going to ask the fifth person, and I'm going to continue answering this fifth person, so on and so on, until I collect, I don't know, maybe 10, ask 10, 30, 40 different people. Random sampling, on the other hand, as it says, everyone has an equal chance of being selected. So you might literally just point out people that are willing to stop and answer a question. You might have some sort of computer model that doles out some numbers, and that is your distance downstream. So here, for example, these are my random people I've been able to ask randomly. Stratified sampling, on the other hand, is when I sort of decide I'm going to categorize people or get some various different locations. I'm going to group them together, and I'm going to select a certain number of people from each particular group or age range or section of a river and things like that. Now, you can combine different sampling techniques. So this is what we call stratified random sampling. So I'm randomly select people from different groups, doesn't matter who, I'm going to randomly select them. On the other hand, we've got stratified systematic sampling, whereas I take regular samples are taken from within certain categories. So in this case, the third person of each group. And here on this slide, what I've done is to try to summarize the main advantages and disadvantages of using these different techniques. Now, there are still some more things to consider. So, for example, you need to make sure that your sample size is large enough to give you a more accurate representation of the whole group that you're trying to target, the river and the location you're carrying out your study in. The sample size needs to take into account the amount of time, energy, money, labour, equipment you have available to you. You need to also consider, can you actually access these locations safely? And your data collector needs to avoid bias. So, for example, if you're doing a questionnaire, you need to make sure that it doesn't favour one person, group, or an opinion. And if it does, this is something that then you need to put into your evaluation. So you've chosen your sites, you've chosen the most accurate sample size. And remember, just let you know that I'll be going through each investigation in separate videos. So please, if you do want those, then depending on the investigation, you might prefer a different sampling technique. So please do make sure that you watch those videos and to get an understanding of which sampling technique is perhaps more appropriate for the different types of investigations. So, in terms of sample size, this one's quite a nice question for you to do. So you can have a look at it. Why would you sample 20 people is too small? A sample of 500 is too big. And again, you need to be clear on what makes an appropriate sample size. So think about urban area. Have you covered enough of the city? Do you have enough sites along the river to show change? How many do you need for a questionnaire? And these are the various points that you could consider. So what do sampling questions look like? Here's one for you. Students decide to test the following hypotheses. Name the sampling method that students could use to select people to answer their questionnaire. Explain why you chose this method. So really, these type of questions, often it doesn't really matter which one you select, but you have to explain the rationale behind your choice, and perhaps that's the most important part. So here, I've given you an overview of what the mark scheme says, and to be honest, these are the type of points that you need to include into your notes, because it takes you through why each of these methods, the benefits of selecting each of these different sampling techniques. Typically, it's best just to do one, don't combine them, and these are the points you need to make. So again, incorporate these into your revision notes. I've given you some more questions here. Why did researchers need to use a sample of people? This justifies why we have to have a sample. Primary and secondary data, what the difference is, and we'll go into that later. I'll put the mark scheme there for you. Sometimes it might actually ask you to look at the disadvantages that you can see in this question here. So again, I've given you some reasons why this particular method questionnaire could, if you use say random sampling or target a particular population, what's the bad points? So again, go back to the previous video, and again, you need to justify how you can select a representative sample of people. And again, here I've given you some more strengths and weaknesses, strengths of using the different techniques that you can incorporate. So remember, you need to be clear on the following: why we sample, types of sampling, and the advantages and disadvantages of using each sampling method, and how they apply to different investigations for you to be able to show me and the examiner which is the most appropriate one. So as mentioned in the previous question, you might be required to understand the difference between primary and secondary. There's quite some good clear differences, and I've tried to summarize what they are, some examples for you in this table for you to incorporate. But essentially, primary is something that you have gone out and collected. It's real, it's up to date, it's in that moment, whereas secondary tends to be you using data that's already been collected. So you've also seen there's primary and secondary data. There's also what we call qualitative and quantitative. Again, differences are summarized in the table, but essentially quantitative is data that can easily be classified into numbers, or it gives you the amount. So for example, how old are you? It's a single response or a very short response, whereas qualitative is where it can't really be measured in numbers. You have to go out and you collect opinions on something, and you might take a photograph, and so really it is it's an opinion, something that you have to get, and then you have to sit through and you garner sort of key themes out from those opinions. So whereas quantitative quickly provides you with an overview, qualitative takes more time to analyze. And again here are the types of questions that could be asked. Typically very short ones, but again, if you know the difference, if you understand what that is, very straightforward marks to get. So primary data, it's this. Secondary data, you can see the responses there. So again, pause the video, use those marks, incorporate them into your notes. Another thing you might be asked to do is to think about risk assessment. Any investigation does carry an element of risk. Lots of these questions are common sense, you just need to think about it, and more often than not, the answer is straightforward. You could be collecting this data in the winter, you could get cold, so how can you avoid cold and hypothermia setting in? You put on a jumper. So when we consider risks and how we can go about minimizing them, key risks are things, as I mentioned, temperature, the fact that the weather could suddenly change, you might be in the sea and there's the tides, you could slip. Is it safe to access the particular locations? If you accidentally drank the water, could you get ill? Could you be in an area that suffers from crime? Time of day? Obviously, collecting investigations at night does carry some sort of risk. Is there traffic implications? And could you get lost? So these are all the types of risks very broadly that could apply to any investigation. And again, watch the other videos to sort of think about which ones tend to be more appropriate to the various different types. Obviously, if you're doing an urban study, tides might not be an issue. If you're doing an urban study, if you're doing a river investigation, potentially traffic might not be an issue if you are just walking along the river. So these are all the various things to consider. So what do questions look like? Here we go. Complete the table by suggesting different ways to reduce these possible risks. How can you avoid slipping on rocks? How can you avoid getting an illness or disease from the river water? Things like that. So if you look at the mark scheme, how can you avoid slipping on the rocks of the river? You wear sensible shoes, protective footwear. Getting a disease from the river water, simply avoid drinking it. Falling into the river, working groups, avoid steep or slippery slopes, things like that. So a lot of it's common sense. Again, some more ways you can do it from a river. Again, here are the type of things to consider. So really think about it. This is a different one. A sign, I can never imagine a sign like this appearing. The coast can be a dangerous place. So what advice could a teacher give you, or instructions would a teacher give you? These are the type of things. And again, here, you might be asked to actually, when you do a risk assessment, often we have to predict the likelihood of that risk from happening and how severe it could be if that risk does occur. And they might ask you to do a calculation here or identify which one has the greater risk. So here, hypothermia setting in because it carries the larger number. So lots of things to consider. And again, another one, things that affect, this might actually think about the risk associated with selecting various sites. And again, here I've given you the mark scheme of the types of things that you might need to consider. So, general points about risk assessments. Really think about, is it accessible? Can you safely get there? Is it safe to operate in? What could weather conditions occur? And are there other hazards like traffic and people and things like that? Another thing that we do before we decide about how to go about and collect the data is carry out a pilot study. And a pilot study is done before the main investigation. It enables us to decide can a full-scale study take place. So things that we might do, we might actually go out and visit those sites. We might trial the methods to see, are they safe and accessible? Do we require any additional costs and resources? So do we need more staff? Do we need bigger groups or smaller groups? Do we need a coach, for example? Do we need to stay overnight? It also enables the students and teachers to familiarise themselves with the equipment that has to be used, and so we can proofread and trial those methods. Here's a question, for example, before the students began working at the 5 fieldwork sites, they did a pilot study. What is a pilot study? And give one reason for doing this. So here we go. And these are a nice summary question that you can apply to pretty much most investigations. And remember, in the other videos I will have, I'll talk about what sort of things, although these are general points, I'll be showing you 1 or 2 things to consider when doing a pilot study, specifically for those different investigations. The next types of questions that you could be asked are the ones that are perhaps the most difficult out of the whole paper, I would argue, and carry in many ways the most marks. These can range anywhere from 3 to 5 marks. So there are 2 types of questions here. First type of question, and these are the ones that are typically worth about 4 marks, you describe how you can collect data for the different investigations. So the exam question might give you a hypothesis, and you have to describe how you can go about collecting data to prove that hypothesis. So it does require you to have knowledge of the equipment and be able to write in a step-by-step way. So that's really quite difficult because you have to be quite concise. And the second types of questions that are attached to these just tend to discuss the reliability of different methods. So what was good about the investigation? Where are the weaknesses? How could that reliability be improved? Now in geography, in these papers, there are a huge range of different methods that you need to be aware of. And so I'm going to give you in this video general points that can apply to all. And by watching the other videos, you can see I go into a lot more detail about the various different methods. So what methods do you need to know? For rivers, you need to know how to calculate the width or find out the width and depth. And then from those calculations, how to then do the cross-sectional area, how to calculate the velocity, the discharge, the wetted perimeter, size and shape of sediments, gradients. And these are ones I have seen, but these have only been one-off. So how you go about with the water pollution, calculate oxygen levels. Now, typically the ones standing out are the ones where you do need to know. The other ones, they would more likely give you sort of a step-by-step of how to calculate it. So it really depends. And again, that's where practice comes in. Now for coasts, you need to calculate the size and shape of sediments, the amount of material, vegetation, and animals within an area, the wave frequency, and the beach profile. So perhaps the physical geography are the ones that carry the most, are perhaps the hardest to know because there are a lot more equipments and they're very specific to that particular investigation. Whereas in human investigations, this could be anything from a tourism to a population to assessment investigation. Questionnaires are really important. Land use, how to calculate pedestrian traffic counts, bipolar or environmental survey, pollution levels, and microclimates. And I made another video about this, but again, this is perhaps a very technical one that again, through lots of practice will help you. How to calculate temperature, cloud cover, wind speed, pressure, sunshine. So you can see that there is huge variety in what you need to learn. And again, you have no choice in which questions come up. You have to answer the paper that's in front of you. But if you look at the mark scheme, there are certain things that you can mention that should help you with the marks. So I'll just take a little bit here. So for example, you might want to get into groups or decide who surveys each site. You might want to choose a variety of sites along the river. You do need to record your results. So the first one very good point you could mention is record those points on a recording sheets. So what to include? And this is probably the step-by-step guide of the certain things you should be aiming to include that should hopefully get you at least out of 5 marks if you have to write a hypothesis certainly at least 2 to 3 marks. So before you start, I would bullet point the equipment you need in the margins. I would then start off writing your answer saying students need to get into groups and decide who surveys each site or who will carry out what. Then you need to write in order using the equipment that you've bullet pointed on the list, how to go about collecting that data. So you need to include the equipment, timings, who does what. After that, you need to state clearly how long you will collect the data for at each site. State that the results will need to be written down on a recording sheet, and repeat this method at several points at the same site to get an average, and repeat it at different sites along the transect. You could also include about the idea that you collect at different times throughout the day. So once you've done those, we now need to move on to evaluation style questions. This is where you discuss the strengths, weaknesses, and improvements. And like I said, in every single, I will put together a whole series of videos on the different investigations, rivers, coasts, etc. So please do watch those because they will go into specific strengths and weaknesses and improvements and the various methods. But these are just general things to consider. So these are the types of questions that you'd be asked in terms of dealing with the weaknesses or difficulties in carrying out something. You've got here to do questionnaires and to do a traffic survey. And if you look at the mark scheme, again, there's some certain generic conditions that you can consider. Safety. Do people understand? The weather. How can you, health risks and things like that. So again, just think it as a little bit of common sense when it comes to these type of investigations. Now, as I said, when I go into the human investigation methods a bit more detail, I will give specific points. But you can see here, again, if you're unsure, really think about a little bit of common sense, put yourself into that position, think, could you ask everyone, do people understand and things like that. This is to do with velocity measurements. Look at the method, what could there be certain issues collecting this data? So here, we're using floats, what it could get stuck. It could be an error in calculation, might not move in a straight line, weather conditions. So general points to consider about the weaknesses with your method. Weather conditions, how could that affect it? Obstacles, was there anything in the way? Could that even be like a traffic jam or some roadworks? Human error, could you agree as a group? Did the people you were interviewing understand the question? All various points to consider. Now, sometimes when considering the strengths of a particular investigation, this can actually help you consider also the weaknesses. So here I've just put a range of examples talking about how can they become more reliable? So what could make it stronger? How could they, again, similar question here about changing the methods, and again, a question about advantages and disadvantages. So when I talk about strengths, really I'm also talking about why was the method good, or how can it become more reliable? So if we look at the various mark schemes here, you can see there are, again, some various common points to mention. You could talk about taking an average, maybe collecting a digital instrument. Why is digital better? And think about the reasons there. So there's no ambiguity in terms of like what it's written is what I write. So there might not be any confusion between people and things like that. It might be easier to use. So again, it's considering what you have and maybe why is that good and how it can become more reliable. And again, my various videos that I will produce talk about each method in a little bit more detail. So some general points to consider about why is it strong or how it can become more reliable. Was the data or is the data easier to collect? Are people working in groups? Were enough sites selected with an area or along the transect? Was it on the same day? Was the average calculated? Does the method select? Does it enable change to be shown? Was buy-ins minimized? And things like that. So it's really, these are the points that really will help you consider, was my method good or how it can be improved to increase its reliability. Now these questions, might not necessarily talk about the strengths. They could also talk about maybe reliability, but actually specific improvements to a particular method. So it's a slight difference. And with these, this talks about an average, maybe doing a pilot study. So again, it's linking back to everything that you've done. So general points about these particular questions. Can you take more measures and calculate averages? Can you repeat at different times and compare? Possibility to work in groups. Collect more data and increase the number of sites. Was there an alternative method? Was there a digital alternative? So these are the various things that you need to consider when actually looking at specific improvements. So again, when you revise, look at each method that you've got, think about the strengths, weaknesses, and how can the reliability or how can that method be changed to make improvements. So yes, reliability and improvements are similar, but whereas I would say that these improvements are actually looking at how you would totally change that particular method and maybe find an alternative. Next section that you get assessed on is data presentation questions. This is pretty much where you could be given examples and you have to complete. These are out of 12 marks. These are really straightforward 12 marks to get. It's almost impossible for me to go through and talk about all the different techniques that there could be there, as I'm about to show you. So really, this is a case, and I know I've said this quite a lot, but it's true, of practice, practice, practice. So for example, you might have to complete a simple scatter graph, pie charts, calculate some octets, complete a line graph, complete a cross-sectional graph, put some flow lines in, triangular graph, a radar graph, land use, do some calculations, for more calculations. So there are so much variation that could be asked, but they are quite sneaky because often they are written in between huge graphs or huge block paragraphs, so please do not miss them. My advice to you is look at examples drawn or calculated and copy exactly how they've drawn theirs. Use a pencil and do practice. Straightforward 12 marks, 20% of your paper. Please do not miss them. The final one is pretty much the data analysis and conclusion, where you've gone about collecting the data and you now need to see if that data shown proves or disproves your hypothesis. 5 marks, and again, there are some key things that you need to write to guarantee some marks, which I'll go through now. So here's one, for example. Hypothesis 1, the rate of infiltration increases as you go further down the lake. From the lake, sorry. Look at the data. Which one has proven that? Here we go. Hypothesis 2, support your decision with evidence from the various data. And another one. So typically with these questions, you are required to use the data specifically collected, and you must include evidence from that. And again, here's a final one. So generally speaking, whenever you do this, unless specifically written, you must use the data from those particular resources, so figure 1 or table 1. And if you notice, they're out of 4 marks, sometimes 3, but generally 4. And there is a certain way that you need to answer this. So the first thing you need to do is state if the hypothesis is true, partly true, or false. It is obvious if it's true, obvious if it's false. If it's not, then it's probably in the middle, so it's partly true. So you need to take the time to think about that. And if you look at the mark scheme, which I'll show you here, again, you get 1 mark for stating if it's true, or partially true, or false. So again, that is something, the first thing you need to write is that, and then you need to pick out the key evidence that supports your statement. So before you start writing, read the question carefully. What does the hypothesis try to improve? Does the question state the hypothesis is true or not? So sometimes it might say hypothesis 2 has been proven to be true. Use evidence to suggest why. Look at data. Does it prove it? If it does, it's true, partially true, or false. And then state the hypothesis. Stating if the hypothesis is true, partially true, or false is the first sentence you write unless you've been told otherwise. That is the first thing you write unless you've been told otherwise, or you tick a box or something like that. And then you find and write evidence to support your view. Again, something that comes with practice, and you can see that you've got some evidence there. Again, guarantees you at least 2 marks. So go out. First thing you write is, unless stated otherwise, is it's true, partially true, or false, and then use the evidence unless stated otherwise to say why. So over to you. This video really was just general guidance about how to approach these questions. I will be publishing more videos that go into specific methods and investigations. With this particular paper, practice does make perfect. So do watch the other videos to find out more about the different investigations, and please subscribe and share. Thank you for listening.